This is Coast Access Radio 104.7 FM, and my guest in the studio this morning is Dr. John Robinson. Welcome back, John.
Good morning.
Now let me just quickly give you a rundown on who John is, so you know who I'm talking to. Now let me read the preface from his book about the author. Now you can sit there and be embarrassed, but that's okay. Dr. John Robinson has master's degrees in mathematics and physics from the University of Auckland and a doctorate in fluid mechanics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's lectured in several universities and worked as a research scientist. While at the Applied Mathematics Division of the DSIR in 1974, he began a career in futures research. Subsequent wide-ranging interdisciplinary projects have included contract work for the DSIR, the OECD, UNESCO, UNEP, which is the United Nations Environmental Programme, and the United Nations University. He's also had associations with the Club of Rome in 1975 through 84. Now, John, that's just a very quick description of your qualifications. You've presented this marvellous little book, which I've only had a chance to quickly skim read because of time, called Cars at the End of the Era, Transport Issues in the New Zealand Greenhouse, and we're going to talk about that this morning. But isn't it somewhat ironic that we've all come to the studio here from the Hutt Valley, Waikanae Beach to Horo, in our respective motor cars, to talk about the problems and the probable demise of those very cars?
Yes, well, we live in the society we live in, fairly obvious point, and
yes.
If society has set up a transport system depend on cars with roads, that's the way we travel. I'm not able to travel easily by public transport unless it's readily available.
Yes, and that's true, isn't it? And to a certain extent, isn't this one of the bigger problems we face, that we are locked into a system and we have to participate in it, even though we can see that in the long term it has some serious traps coming up for us?
Well, we're on the edge of a huge change, a huge crisis and a huge challenge. Intriguingly enough, New Zealand is taking exactly the wrong path. We're building more roads and emphasising more cars, importing cars and so on, just at the time when we're 6 years into the oil peak, 6 years into it. And when will it start dropping away? When will the oil not be available? Nobody knows that. It might be next year or the year after or whatever. The price goes up and down and generally very, very high.
Yes.
And when that comes to an end, it's going to force a complete change on us, and we'll find all our structures that you've mentioned, the roads and things, are wrong for the future. We're not planning for the future at all. There are some people who are aware of this, of course. The Auckland Council wants to push for public transport, but the government is insisting on more and more roads. There's an extraordinarily strong roading lobby in New Zealand.
I guess this is an impossible question in some ways, but why is it that despite the obvious evidence of the decline of oil production and the huge fluctuating costs, because we saw yesterday, as we record this on a Saturday morning, the biggest drop in the oil price they've seen for, I think they said some decades, a one-day collapse of the oil cost. Why do we still have a structure that is locked in to a failing resource?
That's a far bigger question than,
exactly.
than that particular book. You notice the book is focused on New Zealand,
sure, yeah.
New Zealand statistics and things, because the whole global situation where some very powerful groups and very powerful people have got considerable control of their governments in the United States, for example, and they build more and more roads, and they have pushed the whole transport system into that dependency on oil. Oil, by the way, is a totally remarkable fuel. I mean, the amount of energy per litre or per kilogram in oil is so much greater than in a battery.
Yes.
That you can go a long way on filling a tank of your car with oil. It's a remarkable fuel. The problem we face is that there's just a certain amount of it there. A great deal, but the whole world has managed to use up over half of it now. Okay,
let's talk about this book. As you say, it's concerned about the New Zealand situation. Can you briefly give me your concern, your premise, what actually you're trying to tell us in this, or make us think about is a better way to phrase
Well, the
it.
challenge is that you've got a global situation, the end of the oil era, end of the car era, and how does New Zealand fit into that? So that's the main question that is faced there. So you'll find a great number of statistics and facts listed there about New Zealand cars and travel and road accidents and costs and all those sort of things, which are relating very, very much to New Zealand. There's a great deal of amount of facts which are available to us if we know where to look for them, but there's a considerable lack of analysis. So the challenge was to try and write New Zealand into the picture, see where we fit in, and to try and explain to the general reader just what has been happening in New Zealand and where we're going.
Right. I've got this kind of Monty Python image in my head that here we are locked into a system that is going to lead to our own destruction. It's kind of black humour, isn't it?
Yes, but that I've talked already on radio about the whole limits to growth, where people are overpopulating the world and they don't care. They're producing more kids, using more resources, spreading all over the place, heading towards a crisis, ignoring it, denying it.
Let's talk about the social cost of the roading industry. Now that was on I think page 33 I've noted here in your book. Just taking the road deaths as a kind of starting point, we kill perhaps 500 people a year in New Zealand in road crashes. We injure many thousands more, and we harm many tens of thousands more. Now, if that was being caused by a terrorist group, there'd be outrage. But we're allowing part of our society structure to be very destructive within our own midst.
I think the general population is willing to bear the cost. The numbers, by the way, what was around about 400 road fatalities and about 4,000 serious injuries, and an estimate of about 400 premature deaths because of exposure to all the emissions and pollution. That last figure is given as somewhere between 200 and 600. It's a real rough estimate, but it gives you an idea of what the cost is.
Right. But you see, you quote here that in the 2008 year there were 28,588 non-reported minor injuries. So the car's a dangerous thing in our world, isn't it? 28,000 people had bumps, bruises, scratches, and no one has actually stood up and said, hey, let's think about the real impact of this. We just absorb it into our hospital systems.
Yes, I think we could save a fair bit if we moved to public transport. We're not forgetting that no matter how you travel, there's going to be a train will crash down there. I'm not going to mention aeroplane crashing because I think that we've got to move very, very much away from flying.
You're right, and horses kick as well, so you can't win. But let's talk about that whole social cost. We have developed a social structure based around the motor car and the road, but isn't that leading us into a trap? If the car is going to demise, if the demise of the car as we know it is coming, look at the entire structure we have put around us in employment, in all the industries. That's a significant change in our world.
Well, you've used the word we are doing this. I'm not doing anything of the sort. There are some powerful groups, particularly here in New Zealand, we're talking about New Zealand, who are leading the country in the wrong direction. There are many people who are screaming that it is wrong, but they continue with it. The challenge is far greater than is usually realised. Once you come to the end of an oil era, an enormous number of jobs start disappearing. Jobs just in the motor industry itself, jobs building roads, jobs in the tourist industry. New Zealand is a really crazy country which claims to be concerned. Clean green, we're concerned about Kyoto, and we're producing more and more greenhouse gases all the time. The only thing that is reduced in the last couple of years a little bit, the growth in greenhouse gas emissions, is the whole economic crisis which has struck the world.
Right.
But I have mentioned the group who are dominating in our policy definition. I'm a scientist, and I'm desperately concerned that there's no real science in New Zealand. A great deal of science is controlled, and this turns up when you go to a conference by ECA, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority, about the electric car, and they present talks by industry people from Japan, and some of the points they make are absolute rubbish. That electric car with a range of 160k can go from Wellington to Masterton and back, ignoring the hills, ignoring twists and turns, ignoring the fact that their estimate of their range was obtained on a smooth track going round and round in circles. But I did go to a conference like that, and there was one person who raised that point, and that was me.
Right.
So you have a room full of experts who are putting up with all sorts of rubbish and creating a wrong impression and providing wrong information to the politicians. There have been a couple of other books about the car in the last few years,
right,
about New Zealand, The Emperor's New Car and From Smoke to Mirrors. And they're quite different each from the other. Mine is perhaps a more difficult read because it's got more information in it.
Right.
But all of us come out against electric cars.
Right. You've done quite a bit of work on the actual technical mathematical side. And for example, you've worked out the formula of what it would take an electric car to drive over the Rimataka Hills. The height of metres and load, etc., which is good reading, but we won't talk about the numbers on radio because those figures kind of lose people. But let's talk about that whole electric car issue from source of generation through to the wheels turning on the ground. How efficient actually is it when you've got a turbine spinning up on the Waikato River in one of the dams generating electricity? How efficient is it by the time that electricity actually turns the wheels on a car driving down Lambton Quay?
Well, the answer is it's more efficient than burning petrol, getting energy from one place to the wheels. And that has to be taken into account. And you have to be careful about that, or you'll make a wrong estimate about how much electricity might be needed to replace all the cars. The difficulty, an additional difficulty comes in there because it depends on what question you're asking.
Okay.
How much electricity will it take to replace all road transport? 50%, 60%? How much electricity would it take to replace all cars of the same type that we've got now? 20%, 30%. How much electricity would it take off the grid to drive a new fleet of very small electric cars? 12%. And stop and think about the sort of car you've now got. The electric car has a limited range. It's a small car, very, very small car. A lot of the boot is taken up with a whole block of batteries. And in fact, with that limited range, you might as well catch the bus because it's most useful for in-town travel.
So we're talking about golf buggies, really, aren't we, in many ways?
Well, it can be. You can make a rather neat little car that to fit 4 people in, but it's not the average car that's on the road now. Another point, since I'm talking about the reality of the car, it's said you can run round, do less than 160k around the town, and then go home and plug it in. Look at all the cars parked along the roads all over Wellington, all over the country. A great number of people do not have a garage. They can't plug the car in at night.
Right, so there's some simple structure problems, aren't there?
Oh, considerable.
Yes.
Oh, by the way, since we've mentioned the efficiency, it's said that, okay, we produce 60% of our electricity with renewables, and so if we use electricity, it's fine. If you add another 12% or whatever, 20% onto demand for electricity, you'll be creating a need for more electricity, and you'll produce it at the fringe. with fossil fuels, because
Right.
30%, even if a majority is produced by renewables, 30% of electricity is gas and coal and oil.
Right.
And if you keep the demand up, you're going to keep the demand for burning fossil fuels there.
So is it too simplistic to say that the electric car is not going to be the saviour of our roading industry?
Oh, it's a very simple fact, yes it is. The electric car, if we went for lots of them, you're going to spend at the moment from about 3 times the cost of a little wee car.
Right.
For a little wee electric car, with all the problems of recharging and so on. And you've then got a little fleet of little cars for popping around town. And even if from Wellington, suppose you use your car mostly around town, but now and again you want to have a longer trip, so you decide to go across the Macquarie and back. Well, chances are you won't make it.
Right.
You've got hills over there, and twists and turns and so on. And as for the thought of using the same car to head off to Auckland, for example, Wellington to Auckland, no way. I mean, you're going to travel a certain distance and then stop for hours and hours while it's recharged. Hopefully there is a recharging station, and you can could take a tremendous long time. It's a different vehicle.
And I suppose that you won't be towing your big boat all the way to Taupo, will you?
No, that joke, yes.
Let's talk about biofuels. Are they the saviour of our transport industry, or are they just another terrorist appearing on the scene?
Well, everybody's always looking for a magic fix and pretending, but you do have to have a good look at it. First of all, we'll look at the global scene briefly. The energy output compared to the energy input for something like oil used to be up to around 100, so you get 100 times as much energy out of it as you get from getting it out of the ground and so on, and it's down to about 20 now. But the energy output for energy input for plant material into fuels can range between 80% to say 2 or 3 times. And obviously if you're getting 80% of what you put in, it's a total waste of time.
Exactly.
So on the world scene, it's worth having fast growing crops. You want them now, and that's in the tropics, and that's where people need the land, and there's very large populations, and it has led to equivalent slavery in a number of countries.
Right.
When I started looking, I found reference to a number of countries across the world where the conditions are appalling. And I mentioned earlier on these other problems like growing population. Well, food prices worldwide have doubled in the last year. Well, this is only making it worse. New Zealand is a quite different scene, so people have suggested that you can plant the right sort of tree on hillside properties, and this is more a long-term
That's right,
project.
because
So you're
20,
30
yes, yeah.
And the arithmetic is there that if you covered all our hillsides and it worked well, you might make it. But it has been pointed out to me you've got all sorts of property ownership problems, and you'd have to go back and redo your arithmetic and make darn sure that you're getting the energy out that you think you're going to be getting
Right.
out.
So biofuels aren't the quick solution here either, obviously.
Not at all, and you get some real shams. There was a talk about some lovely little biofuel thing down in Queenstown where they're pretending to be also green and lovely in Queenstown. I mean, their whole existence of that town is getting people to fly around the world and fart out greenhouse gases.
Right.
And it's really quite an insult if they're replacing a little bit of their car fuel with something produced out of plants.
One of the things, and I didn't actually talk to you about this before we came on here, was this whole problem of greenhouse gases. We have this issue where they claim our food production animals are actually contributing to greenhouse effect. But isn't there somewhere a balance for humanity that if we're going to eat and drink and survive, then we have to have an acceptable amount of cow farts? There's just no way around it.
I've spoken to federated farmers about this, and they're a bit concerned too. who is in charge of presenting the numbers, really? You've got to ask these questions because you've got a range of measures of greenhouse gas emissions. You have the it's cow burps.
Cow burps, sorry.
Not farts.
Yes.
I made that mistake myself, you see. And you've got that type of contribution. You have the plants which take up greenhouse gases, forests and perhaps the field. You find as you dig into this that a lot of the estimates are so vague that it's not known. It's not known whether a field that the cow is eating the grass on takes in greenhouse gases or gives some out. You just don't know.
Right.
And you've got those, and then you've got the energy and a few other industrial outputs. So you've got a range of greenhouse gas emissions, and what is done is to take what is called the gross emissions. And to take the gross emissions, you get the contribution from plants and throw it away. Ignore it. And with that, you find that the contribution from animals is slightly greater than the contribution from energy use. And I've already indicated that all these calculations are very, very uncertain. But that isn't the right way to go about it. Let's go back a few hundred, 1,000, whatever, millions of years, and you've got the world existing where animals have been burping and farting and all that sort of thing, and breathing, and giving out greenhouse gases, and plants have been taking in greenhouse gases, and there's been some additional impact from the volcano giving out some, and the sea taking in quite a bit, and so on. But this whole natural system about in balance. So the big question we should ask now is, okay, what's the difference now from the natural? And so that therefore the natural side of things should be bunched together, animals, plants, keep them together, and then you get the net greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, these are all referenced in all these lengthy tomes and full of data, and then you find that the contribution of the natural side of things, which have been changed a bit, you see, we've cut down some of the trees and we've introduced different plants. It comes to about I'm sorry, I've got the number missing from the top of my head.
That's all right.
It's about either 12 or 18%, that sort of thing. But the contribution from energy, that includes our cars and so on, is 70%.
Right.
The vast contribution due to the change in behaviour is from cars, buses, trucks, aeroplanes, other energy use. But because of the way the arithmetic is presented, there's been this big hoo-ha about cow burps and cow farts and things, and there has not been. It's very significant. Go back over the last half a dozen years and find all the emphasis from the government telling us to import smaller cars.
Right.
None.
Right, there are two questions I want to ask you out of this. One is about how the research is presented to us, but first let's talk about quickly private transport versus the public, bus, rail. We're always going to need trucks, aren't we? Because there's no way we can shift food from the railway line to the supermarket without a truck. And we're always going to need buses because that's the way that we can efficiently get round. But rail gets bad vibes, doesn't it? It gets bad press in this country.
Well, that's the press. It's not my thinking. I mean, say something obvious. We need far more rail. And you mentioned trucks. I mean, long distance goods should be carried by rail. But that was realised once here in New Zealand. There were laws that insisted that you carry goods long distance by rail. It's completely possible to do.
And other jurisdictions around the world are actually returning back to that emphasis of shifting freight by rail because it's more efficient.
Yes, and then you'll have to face the problem of whether we've got the energy to run the rail.
Yes.
But at the moment we can make that shift, I think, with some comfort for the next 10 or 20 years.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, let's come on to my last question. This is one that my wife and I have puzzled over a number of times. And in the end we give up trying to figure it out. There's an awful lot of data presented to us and we're almost into information overload. Where is the actual truth, as opposed to the, what's the word I want to use, almost propaganda by those who want to espouse their sales and their method. How do we actually discern what's the truth and what's smoke and mirrors? Or is that an impossible question as well?
No. Well, there are a lot of people who can't handle any arithmetic or science. There are a lot of people who can. So I think the important thing is, for a person writing a book such as I have, is to explain what you're doing all the time. And out there in the public, there'll be a lot of school teachers and scientists, engineers, a huge range of people who will be able to read it carefully and say yes, I think, or they'll pick on a problem. The key point here in New Zealand is to free up information from the total control that it's under at the moment. We talk to people at universities who have to keep their nose clean to get promoted and so on. I've come across some really extreme examples of this. And if we go back to the conference, I was talking about all these eager people who knew darn well that the guy was talking nonsense. They didn't raise their voice. You're going to risk your career by speaking out. So we need a lot of people who risk their careers by speaking out, and we need to change the whole career structure, the whole science structure, the whole way that we look at one another and allow one another a lot more freedom to do our job properly.
Right, and this is, I guess, one of the attempts behind your book, Cars at the End of an Era, to actually present out into the public arena some of the factual information that we need to make an informed decision.
That's right.
Right. Now, it's worth reading. I only got the book 2 days ago, as you can see from my marks and scribbles, I'm working my way through it. I presume people can simply go to Friends of the Earth, Google them, and buy a copy that way?
They can, or they get hold of me. And it'll be in some bookshops, but I don't know how many bookshops will be queuing up to take the book.
Right, probably some of the smaller specialist bookshops will
yes.
be having it. Right. Okay, well, the book is Cars at the End of an Era, Transport Issues in the New Zealand Greenhouse. And we never we didn't explore the greenhouse a lot, did we? But I'm sure that's going to be, people can get the book and read it. Well, thank you, John, for coming in today. And folks, can I recommend this book to you as a really interesting read and part of the discussion on the future of our nation. Thank you.
Well, thanks.